Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the French Revolution and the. Let's make sure I'm all the way back. I'm not. Yeah, that's what I thought I was at the beginning. But here we go. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the French Revolution and the age of Napoleon. Obviously, there's been a lot of upheaval in Europe over the past, 25 to 30 years. There's been a lot of upheaval. So it's about 1785 to 1815 or so, right? A lot of upheaval, a lot of things change. There's been a whole revolution in France. The king has been executed. You had Napoleon take over. Napoleon takes over basically all of Europe. Fights wars in Spain, fights wars with Austria, in Russia, with Prussia, and so forth. Napoleon has altered things. The French Revolution has altered things. And so now they're going to have a meeting. It's called the Congress of Vienna, 1814, 1815. This is after Napoleon is captured the first time. You remember Napoleon was captured the first time, right? And he escapes. He's placed on the island of Elba, which is in the Mediterranean, not too far from France and Italy. He escapes and comes back, has his 100 days back. Some of the guys in this meeting have to leave and go back with their troops and fight Napoleon one more time, finally defeating him at the Battle of Waterloo. The man who's running this meeting, the Congress of Vienna, obviously it's meeting in Vienna, so that's a descriptor, right? The Congress, a Congress, just like we have Congress in Washington, D.C., it's a meeting in Vienna. The leader of this is a guy named Metternich. Got his picture there for you. Metternich is the leader. He becomes the leader of the Congress of Vienna. He's an Austrian diplomat, politician, who sort of takes leadership. And the idea here is what are we going to do in Europe? How are we going to handle this in Europe now that everything's been changed? Everything's been, you might say, messed up, certainly altered. Can we go back to the way it was before the French Revolution? Well, some people would hope they could. It's going to be difficult. Well, for example, just pick France. The king's dead. He's been executed. He's been beheaded, right, by the guillotine. How are you going to put the king back on the throne? Not that one, right? And likewise in other countries where things have been altered. How are we going to do it? So they come up with this idea of the Concert of Europe. Now the Concert of Europe is not a musical concert that you might think of, concert we usually think of. But concert here in that, just like, say, in a concert where everything needs to work together. I've been to some concerts where they didn't. You know, like where there's harmony and balance, right? The drums aren't overpowering everything else, and you can hear what's going on. You know, you need a balance. That's what they mean by concert. That Europe will be balanced, that Europe will be stabilized, that Europe will be in harmony. I guess all these kinds of words we might use. So that's what they mean. And in fact, they do a pretty good job. They keep the peace for about 100 years. You know, from major, I mean, there are some battles fought in that 100 years, but there is not the kind of massive warfare that you saw under Napoleon until World War I, which, of course, is 1914. This is 1814, 1815. So they do a pretty good job of balancing things, and that's their goal. Now, to do this, they use three principles set forth in the Congress of Vienna to try to reorganize Europe in the aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Number one is legitimacy. Legitimacy, by this I mean having legitimate ruler of the country, of the area, right? So let's take France, for example. We can't bring back the French king, right? He's gone. But they go and find a relative. They try to find the closest relative to the king they can, and they bring him back as the monarch. Because they say, well, really he's the legitimate, this king, this kingdom, this guy is the closest relative we can find, so he is the logical, legitimate heir to rule France. And so that's what they do. That's just one example. So that's legitimacy. We try to restore the governments to a legitimate ruler, a legitimate government, as it was prior to Napoleon. It's not always possible completely. Second is restitution. Do you know what restitution is? That's a word, we don't use it every day, right? But restitution means, let's say, for example, you are outside and you're throwing a ball around the yard and you throw it through the neighbor's yard, through the window of the neighbor. You break the window. Restitution would mean that you would pay for the window to be restored. That is, either you or somebody would come and put a new window in your neighbor's house. That's restitution. Okay? So restitution here, of course, is saying, France has done a lot of things to a lot of countries, destroyed things and things like that, so they need to make payment of various kinds. They need to make restitution. Sometimes it's returning land that they had taken. Sometimes it's maybe property. It's going to be hard to get all the property back because a lot of stuff they take has already been consumed, all right? Like the chickens and the grain and so forth. And then the third point is stability. And this is really the key as well. They wanted to try to create a stable environment in Europe. Because, the revolution, the French Revolution, we studied it, right? 1787 to like 1815. A lot of people died. I never did try to count up the number. I don't know if we could. I don't know if we have accurate records. But, if you're talking over 25, 30 years, there's a lot of people who die. There's a lot of property that's destroyed, burned up, blown up, whatever. And so everything's been pretty radical, and there's been a lot of fast changing. And so now they say, you know what? We need to slow down, bring some stability to Europe, and maybe we'll have a lot fewer people dying over the next 25 years than we had over the last 25 years, and bring a kind of stability to Europe. Well, that's the idea. Well, here is what things look like. Again, you could study this. We're not going to take the time to study it real carefully, but you can look at it later. But basically, take a look at all of those areas from France over to Russia. Look at all that. And look at all the different territories that are there, all the small countries. The German Confederation of the Rhine and parts of Poland and Prussia and so forth. And then all those territories down in Italy. Basically, they want to bring stability to these lands, some of which are very small and some of which are not very stable. Well, here's the guy that they bring in to be the new king of France, since it's one of our examples. He's called Louis XVIII. Okay? All right, following in the same line, Louis XVII and so forth, 15, 16, 17. He's the 18th. Now, take a look at him in his portrait here. I guess I don't have it handy, the portrait of his predecessor, his last couple of predecessors than he. When you look at him, does he look like a flamboyant king? Very wealthy king, you know, with a lot of fancy... What kind of clothing does he look like he's wearing? Yeah, military, a general, that kind of thing, right? He's got medals, and he's got the little things on his lapels there. He kind of looks like a general. Looks like a serious, and look, they got him, he's seated at the desk. His predecessors always sort of stood in a very, regal pose and had very, sort of long hair and really fancy velvet clothes and so forth. Now, he's not going to appear that way. Look at him. He has his portrait done, sitting at a desk. He's got papers there. He's got a pen. He's taking care of business, and he's dressed like a soldier. This sent a very different image. Yes, I'm a king, but he's not going back to the pre-revolution garb of the king. He's making concessions to the revolution. Another concession that he will make is he will set up a government where he will have he'll have chambers of people, one called the Chamber of the Peers, one the Chamber of the Deputies. This is a concession to the people. In other words, there's going to be a more participation by the people in the government. His predecessors have been absolute monarchs. Basically, what they said goes. I don't really care what you think. Is this the way it's going to be? Why? Because I'm the king, right? But he's going to say, no, we're going to have this sort of like Congress, right? We have a House of Representatives, a Senate. He's going to have two areas, two chambers. One of his peers, now those would be sort of like the nobility. These would be people that he would pick. People from upper class, people from nobility, to be his advisors, that sort of thing. That's the Chamber of Peers. Peers meaning the peer of the king. And then this Chamber of Deputies, this is elected by the people. Basically, you get, for every 100,000 people in France, you get one representative. This is a lot like our House of Representatives, right? Where that's based upon population, the House of Representatives in the United States. And I don't know what the number is of the population, but for every so many people, you get a representative in the House of Representatives. And so, as populations shift, this is why the census becomes so important. One of the reasons it becomes important, and that's coming up 2020, right? This is 2018. So 2020, when that census takes place, they'll look and see where population is and how it's shifted. So, for example, some states the population is getting smaller, other states the population is getting larger. Part of that's because people are moving from one state to another for jobs or whatever. So, that being the case, then they'll actually shift representatives from one state to another. So maybe take one from Ohio and give it to Florida or North Carolina or someplace where things are growing. Okay? All right. So anyway, the idea here is that it would be a representation of the will of the people. So he made concessions. But his successor, the successor to Louis XVIII, is Charles X. King Charles X, by the time he gets the power in 1824, he wants to try to turn back the hands of time. He wants to try to go back to a more, where the king is more in charge. That does not go over well. He tries to change the constitution of France from a sort of constitutional monarchy and give more power to the king. He wants to restrict the middle class and their influence over the government. Well, ultimately, that leads to a revolt, a revolution in France, even though Congress of Vienna wanted stability, since Charles X tried to turn back things too much. So basically this is telling us, you can't go back to pre-French Revolution exactly. You can't, you can maybe still have a king, but you can't have the same kind of absolute monarch that they'd had previously. All right, so that's the difference. Those are the next two rulers of France. Now what happens is, even though they want stability, and there's pretty good stability, but there are going to be uprisings. Why? Because once people start to figure out that, well, we made what some might call progress during the French Revolution, now everything's slowed down, and in fact, it's kind of, some of the stuff is retreating. And so some of the people didn't like that. And so by 1848, there are several uprisings, revolts, in different places. We're not going to talk about all of them, in different places across Europe. For example, in the first 4 months of 1848, there were some 50 different revolts in different countries and cities around Europe. People calling for more self-rule, people calling for more democracy, or at least more democratic approach to the government in Europe. Now, at first, there was some success here, but, the most successful, I suppose, was the one in France, because they got rid of the king. They didn't behead him, by the way. And they brought in, now get this, it probably made some people kind of nervous, they brought in Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew as the ruler of France. He was called Louis Napoleon, or Louis Napoleon. The nephew of Napoleon comes to power. And so we see, again, when the second king there, Charles X, tries to change things too much, the people say, no, we're not going to go back to 1780 or whatever. That's not going to happen. And in fact, they even go for the guy that probably made people nervous because he was related to Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew. Now, overall, the revolts didn't work as well in most places as, say, they did in France. In France, they probably had some of the most notable success. But in most places, they were very limited in their success and scope. Why? I think because they weren't really well organized. We don't like what's going on, we don't want this to happen, and so forth. And we don't have good leaders, we don't have sort of good goals. Now, this is the thing about, well, when you start off on something, if you don't, and I see this a lot in people's lives, if you don't know what your goal is, right? If you don't know where you're going, don't be surprised if you kind of wander and maybe get lost along the way, because you don't really know where you're going. It's kind of like I just get out in my car and I start driving. Where am I going? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll turn here, turn there. Well, generally, maybe I want to get something to eat, but I don't know where I'm going to eat. I don't know where the restaurant is. I don't know what I want to eat. I just want to eat, maybe. So I just drive around and maybe I just kind of stop somewhere and maybe it ends up not being very good. All right? Yeah. So we need to have a goal. These people didn't have a well-organized revolt, but it did send a message. It sent a message to some of them. We got to really be careful. The people who want stability and don't want revolts. We got to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I suppose might be a message to those who are carrying it out. Now, some of this will even continue on, or will carry over. Some of this what's happening in Europe carries over into what we might call the New World, what the Europeans often called the New World, especially South America, or sometimes called Latin America. Because remember, well, I guess we didn't mention it in here, but this area had been settled, taken over, claimed by the Spanish, most of it, some of it by the Portuguese, right? So the Spanish, I don't know, somebody's got a drum set upstairs, I guess. Anyway, by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, one of the things that happens during Napoleon's reign is that he actually attacks Spain. He takes it over. So what does that mean? Spanish control of Latin America, of Central and South America, as well as Portuguese control, is greatly weakened by what's going on in Europe, especially by Napoleon. And the people there who are wanting to be independent of Spain see this as an opportunity. Spain's taking it on the chin from the French. While they're occupied there, let's see if we can get independent here. That makes sense? Yeah, sure. Now, one of the things we have to remember is that what normally happens here, when we see a pattern in what happens in Latin America, is there are people called Creoles. Now, Creole is a term that's just used to mean people who are permanent residents, but they're of European descent. Does that make sense? So let's say somebody's in, let's just say Mexico. We'll pick Mexico. They live in Mexico. Maybe they've lived their whole life there, but their parents are from Spain. Okay? So they have kind of a divided loyalty. Their parents are very loyal to Spain. Of course, they grew up in Mexico, never really been to Spain. So the parents would often send their children back to Spain, especially say to go to college, go to the university, go back for an extended period so they could kind of learn about the homeland and meet all the relatives and all that kind of stuff. But those people begin to see, those people who are really, say, growing up in Latin America, that they're not really like the people back in Spain. But then you have peninsulars. These are people that come to Latin America and they never intend on staying. They're from the peninsula, and by that I mean the Iberian Peninsula. By that I mean Spain and Portugal, right? And so they're coming from the peninsula, and say they're coming to Mexico or wherever, but they're only here 5 years, 10 years. They don't plan on being here long. This is kind of a promotion. This is kind of on a stepping stone of promotion. I'm going to go over here and be a governor, something like that. And then after my tenure as governor, 5 years, 10 years, I'm going to go back to Spain. I'm going to be a bigger wheel back home. So they don't intend on staying in the New World. They don't see that, they're not connected that way to it. It's just a sort of an opportunity for them temporarily. They're here for political gain, maybe financial gain, and then they're going to go back. But these Creoles, that is the people of European descent, mostly Spanish, maybe Portuguese, they are often sent back for education in Europe. And when they're there, they learn about what their parents are hoping is that they learn how great the homeland is and how much they fit in and so on. But often what they come back with are ideas that, hey, there have been a lot of changes across Europe. We don't have those changes back home. To them, they're thinking their home is back in Latin America. We don't have freedom. We don't have the kind of governments. We don't have the sort of freedom to do what we want to do. And they're getting this Enlightenment ideas. And of course, the American Revolution becomes a model for them. Here are people living in this new world who had a European control, and they were able to get their independence. So if they can do it, and if everybody in Europe is saying, oh, this is a great thing, then why don't we do it in Latin America. Okay? And so typically it will be these Creoles people, these people who are of European ancestry who are living in the land, who become the ones who run the revolutions and who try to bring about the change. Okay? All right. So what I'm saying is what's happening with Napoleon and Europe and so forth certainly affects Europe. It's also affecting other places like Latin America. And we're going to see a lot of independent states coming about in Latin America, let's say from 1820 to 1850, 1860. That's where a lot of it's happening. And it's sort of an outgrowth of this. So as we said, Napoleon defeats Spain and Portugal, and this weakens the colonial rule. So we see a lot of revolts from, say, 1807 to 1825. And this is when many of these Latin American states gain their independence from Spain and or France, depending on how you look at it, right? Because France controlled Spain. So by default, France now controls Latin America. Although not very strongly, right? They got other problems. Because by the time they take over Spain, you know, Napoleon's got his own problems with Russia and everything else. Okay? This is really what allows that. It sort of takes the Spanish control away, and the French really don't have the manpower and the wherewithal to sort of come down and impose their control over Latin America. And so most of these countries then, most of these territories of Latin America, say South America, Central America, gain their independence at this time. Say the first 30 years of the 19th century. So how does this happen? Well, you know, interestingly, the very first independent state is Haiti. In 1804, Haiti defeats Napoleon's troops. It's mainly an uprising of about 100,000 slaves. People had been enslaved in Haiti, and Napoleon's troops just, well, they're overtaxed, and they are not expecting such resistance. So I think it's interesting that in the Caribbean, we don't normally think of Haiti as being part of Latin America, but in the Caribbean and Latin America, the very first independent state that's formed in 1804 is actually Haiti. Now, of course, Haiti's had a lot of political unrest over the years, but this is when it gets. This is when they get their independence. How about next? In 1810, we see Mexico gaining its independence from Europe by a Creole. The man pictured here. You see that he, you know, he was of Spanish descent, but he grew up in Mexico, and you know he went over to Spain and he got some more of these ideas, and he decided, you know what, we can be independent, and we, he means Mexico. So this is the kind of model that we're going to see. I'm not going to go through every country, but I'm just giving you some this becomes a kind of model, sort of pattern, that basically those who have been trained, who have sort of European ancestry, are typically the ones who end up leading the independence. Now, of course, the kind of independence that they end up bringing may not necessarily be the sort of independence that everybody in their country might want, right? Because they're still going to sort of run things from the top down, except we no longer are connected to Spain. Now I'm the ruler, see? So. But there are a couple of guys mentioned in your textbook as well. Jose de San Martin and, of course, Simon Bolivar. Martin, in 1810, leads Argentina to independence, and Bolivar, Venezuela. And in fact, the two of them together sort of go around South America, I guess you might say, and help others gain their independence. So Martin and Bolivar work together to help the Spanish get pushed out of several countries. I will put them up here now. Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. And so because of that, they become heroes, they become icons, if you will, of this independence movement. And they are pushing out the Europeans. Yes?
Did you say that Jose and Simon they're both Spanish, so why do they push out the Spanish that were already?
Yeah, they are of Spanish descent. They're like the Creole thing. In other words, it's the idea is my parents or my grandparents are from Spain, but I grew up here, so I identify with Chile or wherever I am. So I think of that as being more my home. I don't think of Spain as being my home. So yeah. So why do they sort of turn on the Spanish when they're Spanish? They are Spanish, but they don't feel like they're Spanish. I mean, they're of Spanish descent, but they don't feel like. Well, I mean, it's kind of like the here in America we have English colonists, many of them of English descent, but they turn on the English to get independence because they don't feel they're being represented well by the English, by the British, and so they fight for independence because they identify themselves as being American or being not like the people back in England. So I think it's similar. I don't know if it's identical, but it's a similar idea that we are of descent of this other country, but we no longer identify with them. We see them as somebody else or a different entity than what we are. Yeah, it's I don't think it's difficult, but I think it is a little bit tricky because part of it is just imagine your perception of who you are and what is home. What is my home and who do I identify with? And they find that I identify with this is my home and these people are my people, not the people back in Spain. Now, of course, later on, some of these leaders, some of them will become criticized because they end up acting a lot like the previous guys who ran things, right? They're not going to full democracy here overnight, right? So it has been a struggle over the years for Latin America because of that, because they're the population and because of perception of democracy, right? Well, this is a big change, and so here we see a map that just highlights that. Again, I won't go through all of it, but you can see here, it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see the dates that are there. Some of them, in Central America are not till 1838, but you see a lot of them, like Brazil, 1822, Paraguay, 1811, Argentina, 1810, Peru, and so forth. So you can see, let's say from about 1804 to 1840, so over a 35-year period, all of these countries become independent. Now that creates its own challenges because they had been pretty dependent economically and militarily upon Europe. And so they were going to have to develop their own economy their own military, their own government. You know, everything's going to have to be developed for all of them pretty much at the same time. This then could become quite tempting to other European powers who say, you know what, these guys don't really have everything together, you know, they don't really have a great military or government yet. We could probably go down there and just sort of take over from the Spanish, right? Now, because of that, the United States, for the first time, this is pretty early in our history, the United States for the first time is going to get involved sort of outside our borders in Latin America, in this hemisphere. They're going to define it as a hemisphere. You see on this little cartoon, we've got the globe up here with the hemispheres of the Americas, right? You've got North and South America. And down below, notice you see the Monroe Doctrine, it says. And then this, I guess, is an early version of Uncle Sam or somebody like this. It's supposed to be like the United States, with a stick, and he's keeping away the Europeans. The Prussians and the British especially. The fear is that Central and South America would be all taken over by especially the British and perhaps also the Prussians, who were both building huge navies at this time and expanding. Well, so Monroe, that is President Monroe, will issue a kind of statement that comes to be called the Monroe Doctrine, that basically says that the Europeans should stay out of this hemisphere. Don't come in and try to take over, and basically says if you do, then the United States is going to come to the aid of any country that the Europeans start to sort of take it over. So it's kind of a warning to the Europeans, I guess. If you're thinking about going down and taking over Venezuela or something, you're not going to take over Venezuela without also involving the U.S. in it. Okay? That's basically what the Monroe Doctrine is. So no European nation is to extend their holdings. Now, there were, you know, the British had some small holdings in Central America. They had a place called Mosquito Coast. Mosquito Coast, yeah. And British Honduras. A part of Honduras, it was British. A few things like that. The French had some small areas, you know, in the north, like French Guyana in the northern part. The Dutch had a Dutch Guyana and so forth. So there were a few European territories that were already there. It wasn't like the United States saying we all have to get out or we're going to come down to fight you. Basically, they said we don't want more of this happening. If so, then the United States would use their armed forces, Navy, whatever, to also help prevent this from happening. So this is called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, which was established in 1823. Now this gets the United States. So the United States has been involved in sort of Latin American affairs or Latin American politics, or however you want to look at it, at least since 1823, probably before that as well. So, you know, for 100 years, roughly, with different results. And so some people who are quite critical of the United States would say, well, this is just the United States trying to take over themselves, right? They're trying to take over all this, control all this territory. I suppose you want to be a more positive look, they're just trying to keep the Europeans out. So I'll let you think about that. But it certainly does get us involved, and I think perhaps without the U.S. saying this, perhaps more Europeans would have come in. And at some point, too, I believe the British wanted to expand their markets, definitely, in this part of the world. Okay. Well, that's another sort of aftermath of the French Revolution. We may not think of it that way, really. Independence of Latin America is related to the French Revolution. Well, yeah, it sort of is. Now, back in Europe, we have other things that are going on back in Europe. One of the things we see happening, we're going to talk about what's going on. Let me just go back to this for now. There is a power in Europe, kind of in between Europe and the Middle East, called the Ottoman Empire. We haven't talked a lot about the Ottoman Empire here. But the Ottoman Empire is established with its capital at Istanbul. And it has a lot of territory, huge amount of territory, all across the Middle East. What today would be Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Egypt, and even across North Africa, as well as areas in Europe, areas like Croatia, right? Albania, Eastern Europe, and the sort of the Baltic states. This was all controlled. Even Greece was controlled at one time by the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire has been in decline, and certainly in the 19th century, it's become clear that the Ottoman Empire is declining. And that makes some people kind of greedy, right? Again, just like we were talking about, if the Spanish have been pushed out in South America, other people might want to come in. Certainly the Ottomans, if they're declining, other people want to move into that. Who are the main ones? Russia, Prussia, Austria, England, France. I mean, they're all looking at this with kind of greedy eyes. Hey, we could use that. Britain saying, yeah, we would like that sea route all the way to the Black Sea, and so forth. And so that's one of the factors that's going to affect Europe, is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is going to bring instability to Europe. These guys are trying to make it stable, but we got a new factor here. A lot of this territory is now potentially up for grabs. I want to make sure I grab it. Well, I can. All right. Other things that are happening is that Italy is fragmented. Italy is fragmented. You know, when you think about Italy today, you think about that whole boot, right? That boot all the way up to the mountains. From the Alps all the way down to Sicily is Italy. That's not the way it was at this time. Italy was divided into several pieces, several principalities, and little kingdoms. And what's going to happen is this guy, with some help, Victor Emmanuel II, is going to push for Italy to become unified with one person. Eventually he will become the king of Italy. I guess that's a spoiler alert, right? People always tell you the spoiler alert after they've already spoiled it. They'll say, you know, that guy was dead the whole movie. Spoiler alert! And you're like, I haven't watched the movie yet. I mean, telling me afterwards it's a spoiler alert actually emphasizes the fact that you just told me something that I won't know, or that I shouldn't know when I watch the movie until probably the end, right? And you just told me, and then you emphasized it by saying you told me. Well, anyway, this is a spoiler alert. Right? So he will become king. He is King Victor Emmanuel II, king of the Piedmont. He will become king of all Italy. So these revolts in 1848 have created some instability in Europe. And if we look at Italy itself, we're going to see that Italy will become unified during this period. It's an interesting process, and we're going to see a very similar process as to how Germany becomes unified. Now, if you think about it, maybe you don't want to, but if you do think about it, if you take a look at World War I and World War II, the main country involved in World War I and World War II is Germany, usually with Italy helping out. But both Italy and Germany are not the kind of countries that we think of them as today at this time. They're fragmented. And so in part, once they become unified, they sort of feel like they've almost missed the party. They've missed out. Because all the other countries, you know, England, France, and so forth, they've been unified that whole time. And they've been out conquering territory, getting colonies, and setting up markets and profiting. And now we have to, I call it, they're playing catch up. We got to catch up to the other countries. And so they really push their expansion in the time that they have. Well, let's take a look at that unification of Italy. We talked about Victor Emmanuel, but here's another big player, and his name is Count Cavour. Count Cavour. See, again, we're getting some good names for children here. Little baby Cavour. I don't know. Well, he becomes the prime minister of the Piedmont area, which is in the north part of Italy, in 1852, with the king of the Piedmont being Victor Emmanuel. And so they kind of come up with a plan, and this guy sort of orchestrates it. How are we going to get all of Italy under the Piedmont's control? How are we going to unify it? Well, one of the things they have, of course, in their favor is that the Piedmont is industrialized. Remember, we've been talking about the Industrial Revolution. Much of Italy, especially in the south, doesn't have any industry. So that means they're quite poor. The northern part of Italy has more money, especially up around the Piedmont. They're more industrialized, have more markets, they have more wealth. By the way, it's still that way today. If you go and visit Italy today, you're up in the north, you're going to have much bigger cities, much more European. If you go in the south, it's going to be much more Mediterranean. Right? And a lot of times, the guys in the south, let's say in the city of Naples, they don't really like the guys up in Milan, Genoa, Florence. Why? Well, they think that those guys, I remember I've been to Italy a few times, and when, you talk to those guys, the guys from the south say the guys in the north are basically, all they think about is business and money. Right? They don't care about people. They don't care about anything but work and having a schedule. The guys down in the south, like around Naples, well, they like to sort of, you're going to have a meeting at 1? Yeah, well, this afternoon we'll have a meeting, that kind of thing, And so the people in the north say the people in the south are lazy. They don't work hard at all. They don't care. So there's still division in Italy. I mean, there's still tension between the north and the south, even though they've been united now for 140 years or so. Well, what Cavour does then is he basically encourages people to revolt in central Italy. Meanwhile, he's sort of doing what I guess we'd call a media campaign. He's promoting the Piedmont as a wealthy place, where it's great living. It's too bad you guys don't have what we have up here in the Piedmont. Oh yeah, we got great jobs, we got great housing, a great economy. It's too bad you guys down there in Naples and stuff don't have this. It's too bad that you don't have this kind of stuff that we have. Now we'd be willing to share that with you, of course. Well, that's the idea. And then the more that there are revolts down there, the more people are saying, you know what, everything's nice and peaceful and tranquil up in the Piedmont, but not down here. Well, part of that's because Cavour is orchestrating it. I mean, he's encouraging revolts in central and southern Italy. He actually sends a guy named Garibaldi to go down and stir up trouble. The Garibaldi people, his men basically wear red shirts. So they're not officially soldiers, but they kind of have a uniform, right? It's kind of like a gang, I guess you'd say. They all wear red shirts so that when they're out in the streets basically causing trouble, we know who's on my side, right? You're wearing a red shirt, you're on my side, and we kind of incite the other people, maybe beat up some of the other people until they get the idea. So it's very interesting how they did it. And eventually, with all the turmoil, a lot of people said, you know what? We need more stability. We need law and order. We need more jobs. We need the Piedmont, basically. And so, to make a long story shorter, by 1861, Victor Emmanuel is the king of Italy. Through this process of, stirring up trouble and offering economic incentives, most of Italy, not all of it, is unified by 1861. The last holdout is the city of Rome, and that's in 1870 that Rome becomes a part of the Kingdom of Italy. And we actually have a unified Italy then by 1870. Through this process that I briefly described. That's how they did it. But that means that Italy now is unified, but, it's pretty far behind a place like England, France, even the Dutch. They haven't had to go through this turmoil. So then Italy has to try to start unifying, still continue that unification culturally, and to build a government. The government in Italy is very confusing to an outsider, maybe to the insiders too. I mean, you know what they have? Here in the United States, sometimes people say, oh, we shouldn't just have two political parties. We should have third party, fourth party, fifth. And I say, boy, be careful. Italy's got, I don't know how many parties. You know what that means? Basically, no one ever really wins the election. You have to have a coalition government every time. So you might have, say, eight powerful political parties, 3 or 4 of them really powerful, and then to get somebody actually in office to set up a government, you're going to have to make a coalition, 3, 4, 5 different political parties, which means that you end up maybe having, like say here in the United States, the president would be one party, the vice president would be another party, secretary of state would be another party, and so forth. And then at any time, what happens, say, in Italy, is if one of the political parties really gets upset with one of the other ones, they can say, we're pulling out of the coalition and we're calling for an election. So they can just end the government overnight because they no longer have a support of the coalition. It's also, they have that way in Israel too. So it's a very different political thing. There's a lot of political wrangling. So I don't know, when people start saying, oh, we need multiple political parties, I'm thinking, that's really not going to make things easier. I think it'll just make it a lot more complicated. And anyway, that's up to you, I guess. But anyway, at least research it before you advocate it, because it gets really messy. And that's what they have in Italy today. So here's what Italy looks like then. You can see where Piedmont is. Do you see it up there? Way up there in the mountains. Kind of a yellowish, tannish color up there. Genoa, way up in the Piedmont. Then you can see the sort of, I don't know, what color is that? Maroon? It's not maroon. Kind of a reddish, purplish color. Most of that is what goes to the Piedmont. By 1859 is just a part up there in the North Milan. Then by 1860, the area, most of Italy. And then 1870, you get Rome. 1866 Venice. So they have to really piece it together, and including the islands. You see Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica all pieced together. So all those were separate entities prior to 1870, 1860. And basically, through this orchestration and movement, they are brought into one. Interesting, I think. Well, then that brings us to Germany. Germany has a similar path to unification. Do you know that at the time of Martin Luther, and I'm talking about the Martin Luther in Germany, not Martin Luther King Jr., who's in the United States. Sometimes people have confused them, so that's why I pointed out. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer of Germany in his time, in the 16th century, there were over 300 different principalities in Germany. 300. Germany has been fragmented for many years. And partially why? Well, nobody really wanted a strong Germany. Does France want a strong Germany? No. Does Austria? No. Does England? No. I mean, as long as Germany is fragmented into 300 tiny principalities, they're really not a threat. Economically, politically. So they had been fragmented for a long time. Now, by the time you get to the 19th century, there had been a lot of talk about unifying Germany, or we might say the German-speaking people. How's that? Maybe that's a better way to put it. The people that speak German having one country, one nation. Well, the assembly in 1848, 1849 of Prussia and so forth could not bring about the unity. But most people believed that there was if Germany was ever to be unified, and a lot of people wanted it to, it's going to happen under one of two ways. It's either going to happen under Austrian control, because the Austrians were fairly powerful, or it's going to happen under Prussia's control. These are both German-speaking territories that are sizable and that are growing in their economy and have a military and so forth. Now, one of the main differences, of course, the Austrians are Roman Catholic. They're further to the south. And the Protestants are further north, and they are Protestants. So this enters the picture then, this guy, Kaiser Wilhelm I. Now, I usually offer, at this point in the semester, some extra credit if anyone by December 1st can grow the actual hair the way this guy has it. Those side, I don't know what those mutton chops, the sideburns coming down. I mean, that's going to take a while maybe. Well, maybe not for some of you. You can do it over the weekend. But, if you can do that, you come and see me, and there'll be a little extra credit in there for you. Now, sometimes the ladies complain and say, "Now, look, we can't grow that kind of thing." I said, "Well, you haven't met all the ladies I have." No. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Let's just see if you're awake. I guess you are. Some of you are awake. Okay, so those are the two possibilities. So ultimately, again, spoiler alert, it's going to happen with the Prussians. See, I just told you. You should go see this movie. The Prussians are going to win, and Kaiser Wilhelm, King Wilhelm is going to become Kaiser Wilhelm. He's going to become the ruler of all Germany. Well, he's still a king in 1862, and he wants to expand the Prussian territory. He certainly wants to expand the Prussian army, military. He wanted to build a larger army. He's ambitious, I guess is what I'm saying. He'd like more territory. He'd love to have all the German-speaking people under his control. Now, you know, he spends most of his time growing that facial hair. So he's going to need help with unifying Germany. And he's going to find the right guy. So if you're looking for, again, Wilhelm, you know, I guess in English we'd call him William, but, you know, Wilhelm in German, right? Well, here is the guy who's going to help him out. Otto von Bismarck. Now, he also has some interesting facial hair. I like his mustache. Well, Otto von Bismarck, you know, when the king runs into trouble, King Wilhelm, he wants to sort of push his government, everybody, to unify and bring everything under Prussian control and unify all the German-speaking people. But the legislature doesn't go along with it, because to do that, you're going to spend some money. You have to build up the military quite a bit. So the king, I think wisely, because he wants to get done what he wants to get done, he goes to this guy right here, Otto von Bismarck. He appoints him the prime minister of Prussia. So you know, when you think of Prussians, you ought to think of guys who are very much organized. Again, this is sort of stereotyping, but I think there's something to it. They're very organized, they're very precise, they're very disciplined. You will do this now, you know. Remember, I took German language, you know, in college. And the first day of class, I noticed, I went into the classroom, it was smaller than this one. And it had a platform up front, you know, a little raised, I don't know, 12 inches. And there was kind of a built-in, you know, big built-in desk there with a stool or something. So I figured, okay, that's where the teacher's going to be. And then there was kind of a blackboard or whatever up front. And then there were sort of fixed desks. You couldn't really move the tables. They were tables like this. And they were going back, and they had chairs. And so I thought, well, okay, you know, he was kind of in that corner, so I'm going to kind of sit, I'll sit like right where you are, there in the center. And that way I'll pay attention, because I knew German was going to be maybe tough for me, right? And this guy's German. The guys that I took German from were born in Germany, all right? That's the guys I studied with. So he is, you know, I'm sitting there in the front row, and a few other students come in. It's not a really packed class. It's like maybe 10, 15 people in there. And he comes walking in. What's the first thing he does? I didn't sit in that chair. I sat in that chair. He grabs that chair. He spins it around, and he sits right there. So it's like I'm sitting there at the same table with him. He's on the opposite side. And he had a habit of pounding the table. Der, die, das. You know, he would say, Herr Weinland, you must learn these things. That's what he'd say to me. Well, you know, he's sort of my image of a Prussian. He's all business, you know. You just have to memorize this stuff. Just learn it. Let's get the business done, you know. That's sort of the Prussian way. Keeping records, being very efficient. I think that's the way Bismarck was. I mean, he was a no-nonsense guy. Bismarck once said that he would unify Germany, and he would unify it with iron and with blood. What do you think he means? Iron and blood. Blut in German. Going to use war. You said what? Trains? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Metal. I'm thinking weapons, but yeah. Certainly industrialization, right? Yeah, trains, technology that they have, military weaponry, and he's willing to shed blood. He's willing to go to war. Now, of course, to do that, he's going to have to deal with three main opponents. He's going to see them as opponents. Three main opponents to German unification. Obviously, Austria doesn't want Prussia to unify Germany under Prussia, because Austria wants to unify German people under Austria. So that's one opponent. Russia has nothing to gain by a powerful Germany. They like the fact that all that territory to their west being broken up into small pieces, because they don't have a threat, they don't feel threatened by it. And likewise, on the other side, France has no interest in seeing Germany being strong either. So you see, you might think France on one side, I guess for you it'd be France on one side, Russia on the other, and here's German territory in the middle. They don't really want that to be powerful and unified because it's more of a threat. So Bismarck recognizes that these would be his three opponents, if you will, to this unity. But interestingly enough, even though he says he's willing to use sort of weaponry and warfare and bloodshed, he's also he uses diplomacy. So he talks really tough, but he's also willing to make deals. That makes sense? So, and I guess, you know, if you don't talk tough, then maybe no one wants to make a deal with you. But they think, well, nothing's going to happen anyway. Why should I make a deal with you? But if I feel like, well, something might happen, I make a deal, I avoid that. Well, that's sort of the way it was. So he goes out and he makes a deal with the Russians. He'll make a deal with the Russians that they won't attack each other. They have a treaty. Then he's going to have to deal with Austria and France more directly. So we're going to see 3 wars will come about. And these are small wars. I mean, they're not, you know, they're limited wars. And he's going to use these wars to unify Germany. By the way, wars can unify people. I think I've told you that before. Wars can unify people, but you gotta remember a couple things. First of all, you gotta win the war. Secondly, you gotta win the war pretty quickly. If you can win the war in a few weeks, a few months, you don't want it to drag on. The longer the war drags on, the less likely you're going to unify people, the more you're going to divide people. So you need to know you can win the war and win it relatively quickly. Well, you know, it's kind of like, I'm sure none of you ever got into any schoolyard fights. Right? Everybody in here looks very peaceful, so that probably never happened. But if you were going to get involved in a fight, somebody came up, maybe you didn't start it, but they're trying to pick a fight with you. You know, some people are looking for trouble, right? And by the way, if you're looking for trouble, you usually find it. You make it happen. And so, you know, maybe they want to fight. Now, if you're going to fight somebody, you probably ought to figure out, do you think you can beat them? If you don't think you can beat them, then probably you don't want to start that fight, right? I don't know, unless you just like getting beat up. And so wars can unify you if you can win it, and if you can win it relatively quickly. This is what Bismarck is going to use. All right, we'll end it there for today.